A few years ago, I found myself doing some serious soul searching. I was on the verge of becoming Roman Catholic, but not without a few, shall we say, doubts or hesitations. Those hesitations were given a more concrete expression when I discovered the ideas of Ivan Illich, himself a Roman Catholic, although one with a somewhat complex relationship with Mother Church. And in wrestling with the ideas of Ivan Illich, I found myself with a number of questions. Of course, Illich passed away several years ago, and so we can't ask these questions of him directly. However, we do have access to a man who knows Illich's thought better than perhaps any living human being, and that is David Cayley. David Cayley was the host of the Ideas program on CBC Radio, and he conducted several long-form interviews with Ivan Illich over the years that they got to know each other. Eventually, they developed a close friendship. And so Cayley, with this knowledge of both Illich the human being and Illich the writer and thinker, was able to put together an incredible, monumental biography of Illich called Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey. You'll be learning about Illich's thought and what he believed about the church, what he believed about the liturgy, as well as some of these topics today that have come up around gender, technology, and development, things like this. All these pressing questions, Illich shines a light in a way that I find to be both incredibly satisfying, but that also leaves me with more contradictions and questions sometimes than when I first began to read him. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this informal conversation with David Cayley about the life and thought of Ivan Illich, along with my good friend Michel Laccade, a fellow Catholic of the Eastern Rite.
Good. It's good to have a doctor.
Good. Well, David, that's great.
All right.
David, I want to thank you, first of all, for writing a magnificent book. I mean, I think people can disagree or agree with Ivan Illich after reading your book, but I don't think they can claim that they don't have a correct and vivid and accurate rendition of his thoughts and life and person. So,
well, thank you. That's
kudos
really
for doing
right
that,
here.
and it's such a lively book. It reads so effortlessly. It's wonderful. So thank you for that. I want to start by asking you if you learned anything new about Ivan Illich or his thoughts through the process of writing this book. I mean, obviously you were very intimate with him before, but did you learn? Is there anything new that came up?
Well, yes, the thing that was, I mean, nothing is ever really new. I mean, as you understand something that you've already understood, again, new dimensions are added to it. So I wouldn't say it was radically new, but I would say the main thing was the theme that I called complementarity. That it came into clearer focus for me as the book went on, that this theme pervaded Illich's work, that everything was about, and there are 10 terms now that can substitute for complementarity, from contradiction to opposed domains, but that was probably the main revelation for me towards the end, was to see that everything could be seen in that light.
That's interesting.
And you know, the theme that I developed in The Rivers North of the Future, that he developed, the corruption of the best of the worst, of course, is a theme of that kind, right? Complementarity, proportionality, right? It's bad in proportion as it was good. It's always that fundamental duality.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I want to just it reminds me that in my 5 pages of questions for you, there was one on this complementarity where I had a question mark because I haven't read her, but I wonder if he was familiar with her. It's Edith Stein, because my understanding is that the theme of complementarity is important in her philosophical work as well. Do you know who?
Edith Stein, who was
Correct.
killed by the Nazis.
Correct.
Yeah, I don't. Ivan's very close friend Lee Chojnacki knew Edith Stein, and we discussed her, but I don't know about Ivan. No idea.
Okay.
Unlikely he wasn't aware of
Right.
her. But
And I think she influenced, to some extent, and again, and I'm not familiar with his work either, but to some extent, John Paul II, who has some of the themes of complementarity. Just a little side note here.
yeah.
David, as I told you, in preparation for this, I mean, if we take Ivan Illich seriously, if he is correct, whatever that means, and we can flesh that out a little bit more, then the important question for me is, what does it mean for Christians? What does it mean for the church? Right? I mean, how? Because he doesn't. Whatever he talks about, and whatever he analyzes, and whatever ideas he brings forth, can be taken to their natural conclusions, and the natural conclusion can be, I mean, I think is something that interests me. At the end of your book, I mean, we're going to jump to the end of the book, perhaps as a focal point for the conversation. At least that interests me. Is you use the term Christian anarchist or Christ the anarchist, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so if we want to put that in context of Illich's main theme about the church having institutionalized or attempted to institutionalize Christian virtue, and in doing so corrupted it in a way, then we have to rewind everything, go back to the beginning of this institution that may happen even from the get-go. I mean, he seems to think that it's sort of baked in to the mystery of Christ, that there's this mystery of iniquity that is there at the inception. Mm-hmm. And so what are we to draw any conclusions, or what conclusions are we to draw about it with respect to the church, the way we understand it? And again, I mean, I think we have to flesh that out a little bit. He talks or thinks primarily about the Latin Church, the Roman Catholic Church. The church can be understood in many different ways. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I would say first, Ivan was a priest, ordained in 1950-51, and eventually withdrew from the active exercise of his priesthood, the formal exercise of it, when he was summoned to Rome in 1968 and subjected to formal processes of inquisition. And then the next year a ban was placed on his academic center in Cuernavaca, and he decided that to keep fighting would just continue sterile controversy, harm the church, that he should withdraw, and he did withdraw. But during the 50s and 60s, he consistently preached what he called a new church. And the most detailed account of what that new church might look like is in an essay called The Vanishing Clergyman, in which he calls for the declericalization of the church, which, when you think about what that might mean, it's a fairly sweeping concept, right? It's a declericalized church is already a completely new church, right? The second thing that he consistently said in the 50s and more, even more in the 60s, was that secularization should be taken as a gift, that as the church was progressively relieved of the social functions it had taken on in the late Roman Empire and exercised ever since, that Christianity would become free to be Christianity. I want to celebrate my faith for no purpose at all, he said in one of the essays of the 60s. So there was already there a vision of a new church, of a, Bonhoeffer spoke of a post-religious Christianity. I think Ivan is absolutely there. I think, so that's the first half of an answer to your question. The second half is that if you read and reread The Rivers North of the Future, which is the interviews he did with me for a CBC broadcast in 2000 and then left with me to publish after his death in 2002, there he lays out this idea of corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best is the worst. So by not accepting a condition in which faith can never be guaranteed, promised, relied on, but lives in doubt in the moment, then he shows the consequences, the worst, as he says, right, that comes from the corruption of the best, from trying to stabilize, guarantee, so many words are possible there, what is not stable, what cannot be guaranteed, what is, he says it beautifully in The Rivers North of the Future, what is a surprise remains a surprise and can exist as nothing but a surprise. So that's a sentence I quote a number of times in the book because it's so important to me, right? There is nothing necessary, he says, about the incarnation. It is a surprise. It remains a surprise and cannot exist as anything else. So by trying to do what cannot be done, one creates the worst. So that is certainly a tragic view, I think, of Christian history. But I don't think it in any way precludes returning to the beginning, returning to the origin, returning to the voice of the one who speaks at any time.
Right.
A long answer to an impossible question.
No, correct. But so at the same time, he pledges fidelity to the church, right? I mean, it's in, I think it's in your book and so forth.
Yes.
So what is he pledging fidelity to? And in what sense does he...
Well, that again was made clear in early writings. I mean, in an interview he did with a woman called Francine Duplessis Gray for the New Yorker in 1969, I think, he distinguishes between the church as she and the church as it. So it is the sociological manifestation against which he says he's free to say whatever he wishes, and indeed he's been saying for 20 years that criticism is a mode in which love for the church should be able to develop, although normally it's met with rejection. But she, the mystery, the pearl in the net, he says, is the church in heaven, if you like. It's the church that can never be owned, pinned down, made to appear on command. And it's to the eternal. It's to that church, to the community which he believes Jesus of Nazareth founded, and his allegiance is absolute and unquestioning to that.
Right, but can they be? I mean, are they separable? Can they be separated? I mean, in a way, it sounds like there's an inevitability that they would be together.
Well, if I could try a story in answer to that, he when on the 500th anniversary of the death of Girolamo Savonarola in Florence, who was burned at the stake, and when he died, the representative of the Pope who was present said that he was excommunicating him from the church on earth and the church in heaven. And Savonarola replied, well, the one you can do, the other you can't do. And Ivan loved that. But he recognized that Savonarola was about to be killed. And he concluded the story, this is in The Rivers North of the Future, by saying, I wish I could die like that. So he was a realist, I think. He understood that he wasn't, because he criticized institutions, I think he was sometimes taken as a man who believed that the world could exist without institutions. But every word we speak threatens to become an institution. There is no world without institutions. So he was a realist about the church. But he certainly believed that the more one mistook the one for the other. Yes, they appear together, right? So I guess you could say in a way that everything he encouraged was to learn to distinguish the two.
Right.
Learn to tell them apart. But no, they're never found apart in purified form on earth.
So
no.
The church, and here I'm going to use, because there's a theme that is important to me that I'll bring up, but I'm going to talk about the apostolic churches in general. So not just the Roman Church, but also the Eastern churches as well. They all claim in their own way that there is clerical abuse, if you will, in the broad sense of the term, and the institutions of the church can certainly be a form of clerical abuse, and I think Illich makes a very good case of that, throughout history from the late Roman periods up until now. But nevertheless, it's supposed to be a real and material manifestation of God in the world. And so the concern would be, if you accept that, from the standpoint of the apostolic churches, or one of them, or all of them together, would say, Illich, you're going on your own. What distinguishes you from a Protestant who just goes back and interprets on your own the Bible? You want to interpret it, emphasize what you want to emphasize, meaning, the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and neglect, right? You start having the individual, the anarchist in a way, which is a bit the Protestant element that I personally would, perhaps recognize in Illich.
I don't think there's a Protestant element in Illich in that sense. I think he tried to do something very unusual, which was to speak about revolutionary change and tradition at the same time, right? And to argue that tradition could be the foundation of change. Mm-hmm. Tradition could be the foundation of freedom. He insisted on that. There, in many places, this book that the Penn State Press published in the same series as my intellectual journey appears, called The Powerless Church, which collected writings from the 50s and 60s. Primarily, there are a couple of later ones. He again and again will say that, right? So he was very, very devoted to tradition, and very much, I think, sometimes to a fault, saw himself as evoking being, he once said, a remainder of the past, someone whose
Sure.
roots go far back. So it's just that that stance was not recognized. It was not allowed. He was taken as a troublemaker and put out, shown the door. But he always insisted that those two things were compatible. And when he was a priest in New York in the 4 years between 51 and 55, he was a devoted priest whose whole sense of what he was doing was to he sought an appointment to a Puerto Rican parish because the thing that interested him when he got to New York in 51, having more or less fled from a career in the Roman bureaucracy, which he was very apt for. He was a brilliant man, and lots of people wanted him to stay in Rome, including the future Pope Paul II. Paul VI, sorry. I'm getting confused. So he went to New York and he sought an appointment in a Puerto Rican parish and became a spokesman for these immigrants who were not immigrants because they came from a colony of the United States, but who were practicing a very different form of Christianity than was recognized by the Italians and Irish who had been persecuted before them, and they were now making these new people feel unwelcome. And Ivan became a very active in trying to, to enlarge the conception of the church, if you like, to make room for the Puerto Ricans in New York. So
yeah. No, it's.
I have a question,
yeah, go ahead. I want to stop. Actually, good point, because I wanted to stop and give you, Charlie, a chance to ask things, and now I come back to this question of tradition, which I think is very important. But go ahead, Charlie.
I just wanted to read a short little section from the book, which I think is related to this conversation about whether he was a Protestant or, even worse, an apostate or something like that. And you write that he spoke of a delicate balance that the Christian needs to find between an unhealthy dependence on the church and excessive independence. There is only, you quote, he said, a narrow way between apostasy and idolatry. And then you write that it's wrong to make a fetish of church rule, but just as bad to reject the church entirely. And when I go back to the period when I first discovered the work of Ivan Illich, it was through one of your radio series. It was through the what became Rivers North of the Future. And at that point, I had recently been baptized a few years ago at a Protestant church in Berkeley. And then I found myself floating around, not really anchored to that community after a move to the East Coast from the West Coast. And then I started considering, which of these denominations gets it right, which is the one true church, so to speak, or at least where can I hang my hat comfortably and find a community. And eventually, I did find my way into the Catholic Church, but I think that Illich was, along the way, both, I think he enhanced the allure of the Catholic Church, but also was a little bit of a stumbling block, because he laid bare so clearly the flaws of the institutional church, but also wrote very eloquently about and seemed to be referring to something of mystical importance that comes from within the church. So in the end, I did make the decision to, cross the cross the Tiber,
The Rubicon.
and I don't regret doing so. But I found that the Catholic Church is the one. It's the church that seems to embrace all of the paradoxes that inevitably come up when you're trying to sort out some of these questions of the individual versus the collective, and just in the way that it embraces the paradox of the incarnation right at the heart. So I guess there's not really a question in here, but if I were to turn it back to you, David, I'd be curious to know, after he as you say, he didn't relinquish his priesthood, but I forget the term that you use in the book, or the way that he framed it in his sort of resignation letter. But in what sense, other than in his own mind, did he remain Catholic? Did he participate in the liturgy? I've heard, or you write about the story when he comes to Oakland and meets with the bishops with his friend Governor Jerry Brown, and they leave the bishops kind of perplexed about what he's talking about. So he had some sort of dialogue, continued to have some sort of dialogue with the clerical elements of the church. But did he have any personal worship practice that was outwardly Catholic?
Yes, I think he and his friend Lee read the office every day, as far as I can remember.
Yeah.
I can remember taking Mass with him. When we were apart, I don't know what he did, but I think he never renounced his priesthood, but he certainly reinterpreted it. And I think when one speaks of the church, he recognized the church. I mean, one cannot fail to recognize it. You know that passage in Don Quixote when the Sancho and the Don literally run into the church, and Don Quixote says, "We've run up against the church, Sancho." So yeah, one cannot fail to run up against the church in that sense. But his superiors made the decisions in lots of ways, right? He was, I believe him when he says that he left the church out of love of the church, left the active practice of his priesthood. I think the church to which he belonged, it was not possible for him to leave, and I don't think he ever did leave it. But I think he, as somebody who came to understand what meaning church might continue to have in future through him, I think he built and seeded little churches wherever he went. That's my feeling about it. But certainly his closest associates in late years were not necessarily formal believers, or may have not been quite clear what they believed, or he was open to many different kinds of people, and I think understood church as when two or three are gathered together in my name. Finally.
And open to all different kinds of people.
But he would never have said, I mean, I'll tell you a story that gives you the strength of this belief. Was one night we were sitting in Mexico, in the place he stayed in, Cotepec, a little barrio in the suburbs of Cuernavaca. And I said I had always considered the passage in which Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will found my church, and what you bind in heaven will be,"
I think that was this. That was the reading.
Will be bound in heaven, and what you loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. And those keys are pretty important to the Roman Catholic Church. And I said I considered the passage an interpolation in the gospel. And he said, well, you may say that, and I've certainly heard a lot of discussion about that over the years, but I take it as spoken. and I take it not only as spoken, but that Jesus, I'm paraphrasing now, in his divine mind, I remember that phrase, will have foreseen everything that would follow down to the three of us. That was him and me and his pal Lee Wojnacki and my pal, sitting there in this summer kitchen outdoors that evening. So that's a very childlike, trusting and unquestioning faith that was also part of his overall makeup of how he saw the world. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Have I answered it all?
Yeah, yeah, and this also kind of dovetails with, I mean, a lot of the issues and the other stumbling blocks that I had in making the decision to become Catholic in spite of my misgivings, and one of those was just the whole idea of Petrine authority and papal infallibility and all of these things that the institution of the Church proclaims as, you know, binding on the conscience of the believer. And another person who sort of helped me over that obstacle was Hans Urs von Balthazar, who you also make a connection to in the book, saying that sort of speculating a little bit that he might have been, that Illich may have been influenced by von Balthazar. I don't remember the exact question on which you were sort of speculating that he was influenced, or what period of thought he was going through.
Well, his an Italian
Carlo
friend,
Coretta.
Fabio
No.
Lana, has been doing a book on Illich's early years, and he had access to some of Illich's books when he was young, and said that the von Balthazar's book, A Theology of History, it's quite a short, beautiful little book, was very well used, very well thumbed, and it just made sense to me that would have been a kind of vade mecum for Ivan. But the book I found that I cite in Intellectual Journey is a book of von Balthazar's called Raising the Bastions, at least translated as Raising the Bastions, on the church and on a new church. And there I found, that's the book where I felt Illich, I could see Illich's spirit most vividly reflected. And I think, I mean, I remember his, I was reading a book about von Balthazar once when I visited him, and I remember his great pleasure in seeing me reading that book.
I think that
he very much encouraged me to explore von Balthazar.
I'll have to check that out. And what was the kind of the thrust of that book, or at least what were the threads that you thought were translated?
Raising the Bastions? Well, it was a vision of, was Ivan's vision of a lay church, a declericalized church, and of the present moment as a moment of opportunity, a moment at which it's possible, von Balthazar says, to say goodbye to the past with a blessing, and to let it go. And that, I mean, that was the spirit of the 1960s in which Illich participated. It's not necessarily what people now think of when they talk about the 60s, right? Because it's often now remembered as an epoch in the history of styles. But in the sense that it was a moment of epiphany, of kairos, of apocalypse in the sense of revelation, I think they both believed that a new church was being born, and perhaps it was, right? Perhaps we see it now in moments of travail, and it's harder to recognize.
Interesting.
But so, David, I mean, a declericalized church, I mean, how would he imagine, because it sounds like he still believed in the Eucharist, I mean, the real presence in the Eucharist, the necessity of the Eucharist for the life of the Christian.
Yes.
there has to be a handing down of knowledge. I mean, a tradition is a handing down of the faith in a certain way. I mean, there's you can understand the institution in different ways, but there has to be at least a little bit of a structure that perdures through time. No.
Yes, but it doesn't have to be a monarchy.
Yes.
Right.
You
I mean, papal monarchy is not the only possible.
You give me an opening.
In the world.
Right.
So his view was that the church had various political models, but they all were states of some kind or another.
David, you give me an opening here.
So he said, why couldn't we have a church based on the evangelical interpretation of prayer rather than on some sort of state-like structure, which is necessarily what we understand as church, whether it's a Byzantine court or a constitutional monarchy or a social service agency, right? Which he wished the imagination to be open to a new understanding of church. He never said he thought he knew what it would be. The Vanishing Clergyman certainly imagines lay celebration of the Eucharist around a dining room table.
Right.
And by far the most meaningful Mass that I ever had was a group of us sitting in a circle in a little sacristy of a Catholic church where Ivan sometimes stayed in North Philadelphia. Just us, in effect, eating that meal together or not, right? So I think he saw that happening in lay communities and circles, and and maybe that's how it should.
And that was maybe one of his writings that was targeted in the Inquisition in terms of his bizarre.
Oh, definitely. It definitely was.
I forget the term that they use, but something like bizarre ideas about the priesthood or.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is sort of striking to consider the change that would have to take place, although with certain communities that are in communion with Rome, actually the church that Michel goes to, a Melkite church, seems like it actually is coming closer in a lot of ways to that idea. For one thing, since COVID began, they celebrate Mass in the living room of the pastor. And the pastor had Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, but he had a career before becoming a priest. He seems more like just a church elder in some ways, although he then went on to study scripture and get a formal education in scriptural studies. But it does kind of make me think about, what the future could hold for the layperson, for the sort of educated layperson. And I mean that in the literal sense, not the sense that it's used more often today, but the educated layperson in the church taking on a pastoral role without necessarily having the all of the functions of a priest of the order of the Levites or.
I think that's very important. This gives me an opening to my. The next set of things I want to talk about, because first of all, Charlie, you told us how you came to the church and how Ivan Illich was both an encouragement and a stumbling block to come into the Roman Catholic Church. I came into the church in part, not completely, or I came back into faith, not just, but into faith through people in the politically libertarian movement, so very radically libertarians who believe in decentralization, who are against, the top-down directives from governments and whatnot. So that's still sort of in my blood, and I'm not afraid of allowing a church to be very decentralized and not having a very, a top-down, a monarchy, essentially. So that when I read Illich, I'm very sympathetic to that. I mean, that really resonates in me very strongly. This libertarian aspect, if you will, or allowing people to the freedom to be human, right? To think what they want to think, and but I, as Charlie just mentioned, with the lucky prompting of our friend David Clayton, who was supposed to join us but couldn't make it, I've joined recently the church into which I was actually baptized as a child, which is the Melkite Church, which is one of the Eastern Catholic churches, and I had almost no experience of it because I was baptized into it as a child in Lebanon, which is where I'm from. But my family is not religious, and therefore I had no religious experience growing up as a child, except for a little bit of catechism when I was 7 or 8 years old, for social reasons. I don't know. I think because I had a friend who was a Roman Catholic, and my parents thought it was a good idea for me to get me out of the house on Wednesday afternoon and learn some catechism with the Jesuits while he was preparing for his first communion. But those were certainly so happy memories of childhood. You know, catechism. I became very pious for a period of a year or two as a child, and then left the church because it was not in our world. My parents were absolutely. My father, probably an atheist. But it wasn't part of our lives until I came back into it. When I came back into it 10 years ago, it was through the Roman Church, prompted by the inspiration of some libertarian Catholic people that I was encountering in political life, and I thought were interesting and sound and made sense to me, and sort of I followed their prompting and rejoined the church through the Roman Catholics here, and then lately through our friend David discovered this Melkite Church, this Eastern Catholic Church in the Bay Area, and we've been there for a couple of years. And I want to mention this a little bit because there's a theologian that you mentioned in your book once, Alexander Schmemann. He's an Orthodox theologian, about the same generation as Illich. He died 20 years before, but I think they were born around the same time. And Schmemann is very influential in our Melkite Church, at least our parish, and certainly our bishop views. And there are a lot of the way that Schmemann views church history. There are many things that are compatible with what Illich says. So when I was reading this book, I kept telling our friend David, my friend, look, he's talking in many ways in the same way that Schmemann is critical of the institutions of the church. It's hierarchical institution, not only pointing the finger at the Roman Church, but in a way, the way the Roman Church has influenced the East from his perspective, the Russian Church as well, having copied having been Latinized in certain ways, and having adopted these very rigid institutions, which I think are wrong. But Schmemann's solution to this, which goes back to the point that you were making about tradition, is to follow the liturgy. So he sees in the liturgy the formal and material continuity through history that can survive and not be corrupted by the monarchy, by the institutions, by the power plays, by the power struggles. And in fact, in many ways, it's oftentimes, at least in the East, kind of neglected and left alone. The West has had its liturgical reforms at various times. One time after the Reformation, they had the Counter-Reformation and the institution of the Latin Mass, so to speak. And then there was another upheaval in Vatican II with another sort of and whereas in the East, there's been a sort of a vernacular, if you want to call it, to a certain extent. I mean, I'm not saying that the institutional church didn't play a role at all in developing the liturgy, but it has developed sort of organically. And Schmemann's view and mission and ambition and whatnot was to revive, to restore the beauty of the liturgy, but to allow it to flourish in a way, and then you can interpret maybe beyond Schmemann in a way that I think our friend David Clayton would think about, in a way that are vernacular, where you allow it to grow organically, and that speaks very strongly to me. And I wonder, first of all, I wonder if Illich was aware of Schmemann. I mean, they were of the same generation, but it seemed that I don't see much in Illich that's. There's a passage where you mentioned that he had some regrets of not knowing Greek fluently enough to read the Greek fathers and the Greek text and whatnot, and he may not have been as familiar with the Eastern tradition as I think. I don't know, right? Or so those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Well, I depend heavily on the people who listen to me and discover thereby the deficiencies of my education to educate me. And I learned about Schmemann from a correspondent after Ivan was dead, and found Schmemann's book, For the Life of the World, to be not only an inspiring book, but one that very much helped me to interpret certain aspects of Illich.
Yeah.
And above all, his book In the Vineyard of the Text, which is on the surface of it a history of reading and writing, but has a lot of it concerns the church and the nature of the church. So I don't know whether what he knew or when he knew it, but I think they're compatible. And there is an essay in that book I mentioned called The Powerless Church. Was originally published in a magazine called The Critic, which was published by the Thomas More Society, early 70s. It's called How Shall We Pass on Christianity? And there he speaks of his devotion to liturgy and to the importance of the unchanging word, right? So this comes back to what I said earlier. You have to take him, you have to believe him, if you do believe him, that he is very much rooted in tradition, but believes that creates a radical freedom, and it's not in any way a confinement, right? It's one of the legs on which you can stand. So I think he shared that, but he also, I think, like Schmemann, found that as soon as the controversy about the Eucharist and around the end of the first millennium, and the question about the real presence, which people tend to associate with the Reformation, but which comes up there for the first time. Well, how can this be, right? How can this be the real body? Then I think for Schmemann, then you already have lost the sense that the world itself is a symbol.
It's a symbol in
So then you've already got a level of symbol and a level of world, and they've diverged. And then of course questions come up. Well, what is symbol? Isn't this just a symbol? Right. And so on. Whereas for Schmemann, Christ is the symbol of symbols. And I heard Illich in Schmemann's voice then. I think that was his view. But he also recognized that was a lost world, that he himself was a creature, a man of letters, a creature of the modern book, right? That we were a long way from that history, which he called monkish reading, right? In which he interprets Hugh of St. Victor, who says that he walks in the vineyard of the page, right? That he tastes the fruit, that it's that real. It's a physical experience, right? Illich recognizes himself as not of that world. He can visit it imaginatively, but he's he's in the age of bookish reading, of the visible text, the interpreted text, and not only that, but is on the threshold of a
Cybernetic
God knows what.
dystopia, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I think I don't know. Schmemann helped me to understand Illich, which, is what I was given to
I'm
chew
glad
on.
I'm glad you say that.
So,
I'm glad you say that because I certainly recognized a lot of Schmemann in reading Illich. But Schmemann ended up so trying to, and it's not. I mean, it's not like Schmemann's influence is very pervasive in the East. He's had an influence. He continues to have it. We're trying to allow it to blossom, right? But he decided to work obviously within the existing institution, which, granted, in the East, in the Orthodox churches, it is already by de facto much more fragmented and decentralized than in the Roman monarchy, so to speak. So it's a bit of a shame if Illich did not know of Schmemann, that they did not meet or exchange viewpoints, so to speak. It would have been interesting to know that if they had been able to connect to one another, because it seems to me my personal view with all this is that the real difficulty in this church, which we want to believe is the mystical body of Christ, right, and has to be united. And so the problem with the schism between East and West is really which ended up, if you read the history, is a lot of it is political, right? It has to do with state power and the power struggle between Constantinople and Rome and that sort of thing. I mean, that's the real tragedy, and neither side can really claim to have the fullness of truth. So to the extent that the Roman Catholics think that they do, I think they're wrong if they're missing that. I mean, it couldn't possibly be. The Romans do not view the East as heretical, right? They view them as schismatic. Well, if they're schismatic, how can you have the fullness of the truth without your other half, which is really should be part of the church, and vice versa? The East did recognize some special role for Rome, for the Church of Rome. It's debatable exactly what that, but there was some clearly. I mean, it's acknowledged that the East viewed Rome as having a special role, and therefore, without
Primacy
Rome, they cannot
among
claim
equals,
right primacy. Right, however you interpret that phrase, it cannot being separated like this. The Spirit, who's supposed to be the soul of the church, right? I mean, how can the Spirit move and express and shepherd the church when the church itself is materially divided in such a way? And so my question here is, I wonder if Illich was in a way a little bit more radical because he thought primarily of the church in terms of the Roman Church, and therefore was forced to became radicalized a little bit because the Roman Church is so hierarchical and in a way authoritarian.
well, I don't know who can answer your question, but it's quite possible. There's a great deal I don't know. Right? I know I've just published a 500-page book, but that book is a wrestle with Illich's published thought, and with specifically the things that he gave to me in several books and interviews and in conversation. But we didn't become friends until the later 1980s. I knew him briefly in the 60s. So there's a great deal. For all I know, he and Schmemann had tea regularly. Wasn't Schmemann's church in New York? Yeah. So, there's a lot I don't know about this, and a lot of things I never asked him that I later wished I would have asked him, So you can't, there's a lot I probably can't tell you about how he viewed the Eastern Church or what he knew about it or who his friends were in that milieu, right?
Among the people that I see citing Illich online, so even on Twitter, there's people that I've encountered who promote Illich's work, and I think sometimes there's a tendency where we all want to claim him to promote some plank of our own political agenda, and what I appreciate about your book, there was one line in particular that really jumped out at me in terms of clarifying something that had always been somewhere in the back of my mind, but I think that the way you phrase it is sort of spot on in terms of how it's hard to pin down Illich, but also it's getting harder and harder to pin down anybody according to the old labels of things like liberal, conservative. But the quote that I like is, after saying that Illich is profoundly a liberal, meaning that he recognized freedom as the highest good, you say, "I know it's a much abused word, liberal, and hard to parse in a world where liberals who advocate a reduced state are called conservatives, and conservatives who argue for the preservation of common goods are called liberals." I chuckled when I read that because I think that, to an American audience in particular, when you think of someone who advocates a reduced state being liberal, that makes them scratch their head. And when you think of them advocating for someone who would argue for environmental protection and call them a conservative, then that would also leave them scratching their head. But I like this as kind of a way to jam up the works of people's tendency to put labels on things. So I might use this in the future where I'll say, well, yes, I'm liberal. I'm liberal in the sense that I advocate a reduced state, but I'm also conservative in the sense that I want to promote the common good. And that'll buy me some time to, come up with my next response. But yeah, I think this question of politics and Illich's politics, at the risk of again trying to sort of use him as part of a narrow political agenda, I am sort of interested in the nexus between Illich's thought and the sort of the libertarian school of thought, which puts most of the blame on government as opposed to institutions in general. It seems like Illich is certainly willing to at least extend his critique of institutions, very much into the private sector and also into civil society and medicine and education, all of which government is to varying degrees involved. But maybe we can bring it back to this idea of Illich as a Christian anarchist, or as conceiving of Christ as a sort of anarchist figure, or another term that I like is a political atheist, someone who doesn't believe that Caesar is God.
That's good. Yeah. Well, he never really discussed this, and the idea that he's an anarchist, he in a conversation with his friend Doug Lummis, who's a political theorist, which never got published as far as I know, which I quote in the book. He says that if you have to call me something, probably anarchist will do, but I probably for myself would choose the term that my friend Paul Goodman used, which was Goodman's last book, New Reformation, was subtitled Notes of a Neolithic Conservative. So what exactly is Neolithic conservatism, right? How are you going to operationalize that? So I think he doesn't have a political label. It's been absolutely striking to me during the pandemic, as somebody who saw himself as in the lineage of Karl Polanyi, and Polanyi was an inspiration to Illich, explicitly so. And yet Polanyi spent his life criticizing the Vienna School, von Mises, Hayek, and so on, that are the fount of libertarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I found during the pandemic that it's at the American Institute for Economic Research, a central institution, I think, of American libertarianism, that the views that I find most congenial, the views of the great Barrington Declaration, are being expressed at a libertarian institution where I think, but pardon me, but then I'm a Polanyian. I'm against these people. So I think it really, we need that unlikeliest of things, a new conversation, to try and see if people can't find new ways of speaking to each other across these crazy divides, which are really pretty arbitrary at this point. For me, Illich read one way. I don't see how you can not read him as a libertarian.
For sure.
But then he's a profound critic of the market, right? And of the founding intuitions of the founding axioms of our economics. Scarcity is the concept which he felt was at the root of institutional overgrowth. So he rejects the whole of modern economics, or wants to rethink it, which is bread and butter for common garden libertarianism. So you're really, one of his most important essays for me was, I think, first published in Shadow Work, 1980. It's called Three Dimensions of Public Choice, or Three Dimensions of Public Option, in another version, in which he says, essentially, you're not going to get anywhere with just a single left-right axis on which to plot political decisions, because you're missing a second axis of technological choice, and you're missing a third axis, which for him runs, borrowing some terms from his friend Erich Fromm, says, from having to being. That is, does this thing, technology, institution, whatever, enable me to do something, or to have something, to be something, or to acquire something? So it really runs from what he tried to call the vernacular, or the homemade, what is still within our hands, to what is out of reach. And so he said, with those three axes, or you could probably plot the field of political choice with reasonable accuracy, but using only the one, it would be hopelessly mystifying. And I was so sure that would make sense to my contemporaries, and I would not have predicted in 1980 that in 2021 we would still be trying to put everybody on the left or the right. Like, it's nonsensical, and it shows up as nonsensical and stupefying, I think, in contemporary discussion. So, Charlie, you've disappeared from my screen, but I hope you still hear me. Oh, okay. Oh, that was a choice. You disappeared earlier. I'm a bit of a tyro with these techniques.
There are philosophical lacunae in in the modern discourse, the modern debate. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody is talking mechanistically, or with mechanistic presuppositions, including in politics, including in economics. And there's a way to defend the market that can be made without mechanistic presuppositions. And if you do apply mechanistic presuppositions, you veer off, and you get a market that becomes horrific. And I think that's what Illich was criticizing. On the other hand, right.
Yes, exactly. I think that.
Right, and on the other hand, same thing with politics. If you think about political liberalism in the Lockean atomistic way, it gets terrible. You have to understand, but you have to understand what the common good is, and the way the current left understands the common good is in mechanistic ways. The common good is just a stash of good things to be doled out to the population, right? It's going to be an agglomeration of particular goods that the government will distribute, which is not the definition of the common good understood properly in its Aristotelian way, if you will. So I think unless there's a philosophical work that needs to be done to move the conversation forward.
Yes.
Right.
While we're still on the topic of politics, there was something that I wanted to bring up, partly because it's the most fresh in my mind, based on the part of the book that I'm in. I haven't finished it yet, but I just got through the chapter on gender, and that was an idea that I hadn't really been familiar with as part of Illich's work, and this idea of gender as a heuristic, as a perceptual mode for understanding the past versus the present. And I think that also puts the finger on something that I'd been trying to figure out about the modern environment, where we have the kind of extreme woke culture that has permeated, in particular, if you look at like the corporate Twitter accounts, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, they're some of the most outspoken voices promoting what is known as like a progressive view of gender. And I don't think that Illich in his time necessarily had to confront the issues around transgender and these other issues, kind of hot button issues. But I would have been curious to know what he would have thought. And I think that he talks about it a little bit, I guess, in terms of sex. He says that there are many different sexes. He acknowledges that you can have many different sexes, but that gender seems like it's implicit in his writing that for him gender is a binary. But the connection between global capitalism, mega corporations, who in some sense, without getting conspiratorial, have an interest in a leveling or in a having just one global market, as opposed to the vernacular, the world of craftsmanship and of differentiated realms between not just men and women, but these other sort of distinct spheres. This is more of an observation than a question, but just that it clicked to me how the erosion of gender as this sort of category or perceptual mode has contributed to the ability of nameless, faceless corporations to sort of set the agenda or have their way in a society that no longer strongly identifies as one or the other. And obviously, it's we don't want to put words in his mouth on a contentious political issue, but I would be curious to know sort of how the transgender question how he might have addressed that, or given us some tools to think more thoughtfully about it, because I think that there's a lot of sort of reaction and identity politics bound up with that, where there's not actually a lot of thoughtful conversation.
Well, I'd be reluctant to put words in his mouth, because I never heard a word from his mouth on this subject, but I think he was impressed by old societies in their ability to deal with ambiguous cases and to allow for transgression of boundaries. So I think he although insisting on that gender was in a sense absolute while it existed, right? That you were born and bred into it, he says. I mean, I think he probably said things in that book that he would have revised later had he been able to. But above all, gender is the foundation level of a mode of thought. That's what he's really saying there. And that was an impossible point to get across when he gave the lectures that formed that book in
Just
Berkeley,
up the hill.
1982. He wasn't understood at all. But so I mean, yeah. To me, what the important point there is that's unless otherness is possible, real otherness is possible, so that I have the sense that I can't not only reach the other gender, that I can't ever fully reach you, right? Or you, me, that we are, that there is real difference, there's a real limit to understanding, there's a real need to exercise imagination, that finally is the unbelievable distance between me and God, the unbridgeable distance. So he sees sex as a monotony, a monochrome, that we're all the same, right? It's a leveling. It's an idea of equality, but it's also an idea that we're all the same, right? We have degrees or kinds of sexuality, as we say, but it's all one thing.
Right.
So there's not that fundamental duality that he feels is constitutive of the world. That the livingness of the world depends on a difference, on my taking a difference seriously. It's only in that way that what is going to come to me is able to come to me. If I have been able, through my understanding of how reality is constituted, to learn to wait, to learn to be surprised, to learn that I never can know what might arrive, what could arrive. It's so much the opposite of the project of control, but it's also the opposite of the project of enforced equality. And so, I mean, gender is a wild book. It's full of riches, but it's, as I said in my book, there's a joke in an old Canadian novel about a distracted lover who jumps on his horse and rides madly off in all directions. Gender is kind of madly off in all directions. He was in a very excited phase of discovery and thought he was producing an essay in economic history and in church history, and to then be, stopped, like, absolutely, and denounced. And ever afterwards, that book was known to people as a book they didn't need to read, because they already knew that it was a reactionary, anti-feminist essay. I again and again met people who rejected that book without ever encountering the book. It was an extraordinary change in his fortunes, if you like, in his standing and his ability to speak to the progressive movements. Was badly injured by that book. So I've ducked the question as well as I could, Charlie. I wish you'd cover back.
Sure.
There you are.
When you're talking about difference,
Right.
makes me think of another interlocutor of yours, René Girard, with his idea of mimetic rivalry, and that paradoxically, when the world becomes less and less differentiated, as it has with capitalism, the rivalries become more and more intense, maybe including between men and women, where we used to maybe compete within our own gender in the mating market and the like. Now we're also all competing in one global labor market or one global skill market.
Yes.
And I've heard people that have tried to connect the thought of Illich and Girard, but I'm curious if you have any sort of synthesis of their thought beyond that idea of the crisis of undifferentiation.
That's a big, interesting issue. Before the pandemic hit, I had planned to go to the annual meeting of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, which was to be held at Purdue University last July. And of course it was canceled, and there to try finally and make a statement about how these two bodies of thought relate to each other. But it was canceled, so I was able to postpone the reckoning, and so it's an open question for me. I think it's clear that Illich took early Girard, Deceit, Desire in the Novel, mimetic theory very seriously at the time he wrote Shadow Work, 1980. But he kept the mature Girard, the fully developed synthesis, which you would say was completed with things hidden since the foundation of the world. He kept that at a distance for reasons he never really disclosed to me. I think there was I found a similar reservation in John Milbank about Girard. I think it had to do with maybe a feeling that there was a sort of positivistic element in Girard's interpretation, that he, with a hermeneutic principle, he could unfold every text, right? And I think Ivan somehow held that at a distance, and yet they're very, very similar, very close in a lot of ways. So my answer is to be continued.
Very cool. Well, let me know.
Or maybe you'd like.
Maybe I'll try to put pen to paper on that. But it does sound like a big assignment, and I'll need to actually go deeper into the primary source material of Illich's work after I finish your book. And if you do end up going to the next colloquium, let me know, and maybe we could meet up.
I will let you know. Absolutely, yeah.
Well,
Michel, you must have at least 6 more pages of questions now.
Yeah, I do, but I have David is very patient with us, and I think I don't want to abuse of his patience, and I think we'll leave it at that for now. It's been wonderful, really
yes, all right.
Terrific. I had a quick, maybe we'll do it, my last question off the record. I don't think it's very important. We'll just...
Okay.
But I'm done here, Charlie.
Well, we'll see.
Do you have any?
No, I mean, I would say, David, if you've got a few more minutes, I've got a few more minutes, and I'd like to hear the question. Sometimes the off-the-record stuff is the... I'm fine. I'll pretend to turn off the keyhole here.
All right. No, it's a minor thing, but part of the rift between Illich and the Church, the Inquisition, didn't it have to do with his position on contraception? Or at least his... I thought there was... he was critical of the attention given to contraception as opposed to the attention that he thought should be given to nuclear disarmament by the Church.
excommunicating certain politicians.
I don't know if that ever became
Okay.
a big issue. That he told me that story, and that the day that they approved a statement which is not that bad on nuclear weapons, but did leave a little door open it did leave a door open against unilateral disarmament. And he condemned that and said, the church, to be the church, must make an absolute condemnation and not a politically nuanced condemnation of the very existence of nuclear arms. And then he had his friend draw this little caricature, which shows a flaccid penis with a condom on it, and then an array of nuclear rockets. And the sequence of popes are pointing at one or the other object and saying it's against nature. And Illich says, yes, I'm proud to be associated with an institution that can still say it's against nature, but the finger might be pointing at the wrong object. So yes, he did say that to make an issue of contraception more than of nuclear arms. But he was, on the whole, I think, pretty discreet on those questions. And so I'm not sure that was a casus belli with the Vatican compared to, he had
Sure,
enemies.
I can imagine. Right.
In Mexico, that the CDOC had created many enemies in a very conservative Latin American church.
No, I can.
There was the clergyman. There were so many issues in a way, right, that had been there, and that when Cardinal Spellman, who had protected Illich, died, I think just the forces were set loose.
No, I can see that. But then my question is, if he did he? I don't know what his position with respect to contraception was, but towards the end of his life, or looking back, conservative Christians, Catholics, whatnot. We look at the sexual revolution as a total disaster, socially and so forth. And the position of the church on contraception is complex, and it's difficult. Can be difficult to understand. But at the end of the day, wasn't it the right call to be firm on contraception? We haven't had a nuclear holocaust, but we've had a sexual revolution with, and all its consequences with abortion and all that stuff and all these things. So I'm wondering if he saw that perhaps there was a little bit more wisdom. I don't know. And again, I'm not sure that the way the church has done these things. Okay.
I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think that he saw certain things as being within the discretion of people, properly understood that not everything was the church's business.
Right.
If that can be understood.
Right.
But
it's true. You can see it in two ways. You can see. If it's Mother Church and she has to teach, and she has she can teach authoritatively and in a bad way, or she can teach in a good way. But there may be a teaching that is both correct and important with respect to contraception, although difficult to understand and so forth. And just a thought. But you don't know that he didn't think about it or talk about contraception later on in different ways, or right? Okay.
We never talked about it.
Okay.
We never talked about it. There is an implication in writings on gender that the world really has, I mean, he clearly felt that for the Pope to declare that a fertilized egg constitutes life, and that the church and the state have an interest then in protecting that life.
I saw that. Actually, it was in my notes of something that, right.
So
Life as idol.
He did clearly say that, you know, at quickening, yes, a woman declares to the world that a baby is coming, right? But to the surveillance of this whole thing, right, is he regards it as the business of women.
Yeah,
He says that.
I mean, I can understand that it would be. Well, I think it's, again, it's interesting because that's a debatable point. I mean, I can see his point, but I can see it's not clear to me. I mean, if the church is correct, and if this is a human life from the moment of conception, then it has implications for society, and therefore, I mean, there has to be consequences to be taken, including the intervention of the state. I mean, that seems reasonable to me. I'm not saying so. I mean, it's an if, but.
Well,
Yeah.
this is a tricky point, because if you believe that certain things that exist should not exist,
Right.
right? And if you believe in, let's say, a vernacular sphere, like a radically increased realm of personal and communal sovereignty, right? That he begins to criticize from the, I mean, there's an essay called Vernacular Values in Shadow Work, which is about the work of a Spanish grammarian,
Right.
Antonio Nebrija, who wants to create the Castilian language on a glorious objective, which was shared by English humanists and French humanists and Dutch humanists, and who could be against it? But what Ivan sees is the beginning of universal education.
Right. Mandatory. Right.
Of the destruction of the realm in which people invent their own words, stand by their own words, have a certain cultural integrity. Now, if you believe in that, but it doesn't actually exist anymore, where are you standing?
Yeah, but
He believes that the womb is not a public place. You're saying, but it is a public place because we can see into it. That's the new reality. So we have to we have to treat the fertilized egg as a citizen.
right. But
Ivan says no, but he's clearly trying to argue against something which has already come into existence technologically. So
that's right.
he says, let me take a less controversial example, right? He says at one point to me, as long as you think about the whole world, i.e., you imagine yourself as able to see or to participate in a planet, the time for human beings is over. As long as you think about the whole world, the time for human beings is over. Well, maybe the time for human beings is over. Clearly, we can see the whole world. No one is affrighted when somebody says they want to manage the planet, or that we should manage it better, or they're going to save life on Earth, or saving the planet. All these phrases are current. We can see it. We have the pictures. We have the evidence. There it hangs in space. And how can he go around saying no? Well, to me, he was a man who taught me to limit myself.
Right.
He said you can see too much, you can know too much. There are things that can burn out hearts if they are contemplated in the wrong way, right? That we actually are responsible for how we see, how we experience, how we live. But if you're living in a world that's technologically extended as this one is, right? It's a very difficult position to
Right,
maintain.
but to be fair,
And it can look like nonsense, and it can look like a sheer defiance of reality.
but to be fair, I mean, I think the church's position on that question of conception, it does not rest on the scientific ability to see the zygote. Granted, Ratzinger made the argument using science, but it's only one argument. I mean, the church can go back to a long-standing maybe history of taking position against abortion and that sort of thing, which is very nuanced. I'm not saying that it's clear. It's very nuanced. Clearly, Aquinas thought that it was only a human being after quickening and that sort of thing. So that can be disputed and all that stuff. The humanity of the conceptus is actually a philosophical question, or can be solved philosophically. It does not require scientific inquiry or gaze, if you will, as far as I'm concerned. So, and therefore, if the church, so if the point is that the church should not use the scientific means to come up with moral stances and bring in the strong arm of the government to invade people's privacies, I think I agree with him. On the other hand, if it's the church's position that the zygote is a human being, which I think can be defended philosophically, then I think the church does have a responsibility to speak out and to say, no, don't do that. Don't, because generally the state is going to have the interest of saying that it's just a clump of cells and all of that. I mean, generally speaking, the church is going to go in opposition to the mainstream of history for that. So it seems to me that it's, I mean, I thought that his criticism of Ratzinger was a little bit unfair, or maybe, I mean, I could have seen it, because I think that conception is defensible, and if it's defensible, then the church would have an obligation to speak out in defense of, even if it's...
Well, I can imagine you and he would have had an interesting discussion about it. I would have liked to be there.
Right.
I know that he conceived his task. He says this very explicit. He gave an address to a group of Catholic philosophers. They met in Los Angeles in around 1995, and the essay is called "Philosophy, Artifacts, Friendship," and you could find it online. It should be published in English, but it isn't yet. But it will be. And he says there that he sees what he has tried to do as a new asceticism, right? That is the fallout of technology, the symbolic fallout, not what technology does and the ill effects of what it does, but what it says to us about what we are, right? So it fundamentally can change our idea of what we are. That has been his task, to direct attention to that, right? So the technological gaze into the womb, what it says about what we are.
Right. Fair.
Now, are there other aspects of the subject that he would have acknowledged in conversation with you? My guess is yes. Right? My guess is yes. He never was a man to try and say everything. He insisted that his thought was proscriptive, not prescriptive. but not that he thought it was his task to prescribe everything, just these things that he thought were salient, right? But so anyway, that
fair enough.
That
fair
leaves
enough.
the ending open.
Fair enough.
Good,
Yes.
What a pleasure to hang out with you two.
It really was.
Thank
yeah,
you.
this is a real treat. It's not. It's rare to be able to have this caliber of conversation, and it's really special. So thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.